The disaster site was silent for a split second that stretched into eternity. Dust swirled in the sunlight, cutting through collapsed beams. Then it happened. Daniel Lee's chest moved. A faint intake of air, jagged and impossible, broke through the ruinous stillness. Around him, the world seemed to stall. Rescue crews froze in disbelief, their helmets tilting as if collective hallucination had overtaken them. By every measure, this man had been gone nearly 20 minutes, his body stiff with the chill of collapse. Yet the faint rattle in his throat pierced through the hopelessness like a flare in the night. The scene was so unthinkable that even the hardened fire chief staggered back, uncertain of his senses. This breath, weak yet undeniable, shattered the laws of medicine. Something impossible had occurred, and the ground itself seemed to tremble under the weight of that revelation. Every sound at the disaster site vanished. Heavy machinery stilled, shouts died on tongues. Even the dust seemed to hang heavier in the stale air. A crowd gathered in tight semicircles, eyes fixed on Daniel's trembling chest. The first responders who moments earlier had mocked the paramedic now stood frozen, caught between awe and terror. The stillness carried judgment, a suspended verdict on what they had just witnessed. Some dared to glance at each other, seeking confirmation that this was real, that they weren't trapped in some delirium of exhaustion. Their silence was not peaceful, but suffocating, a weight pressing down harder than the rubble itself. In that unbearable pause, the figure kneeling over Daniel held the only motion. Her hands were relentless, her movements precise, as if she had been waiting for this moment when science would falter and instinct alone would drag life back from death.
Before the impossible breath, there had been chaos. At 2:47 p.m., the heart of downtown Phoenix split open with a groaning roar. An apartment building, already weakened by construction, gave way under its own steel and concrete bones. Floors pancaked into each other, sending plumes of choking dust across the skyline. Cars screeched to halts, glass shattered outward, and screams rose from trapped throats buried under debris. Rescue sirens screamed as emergency crews descended, lights flashing against the smoke-choked ruins. The ground itself seemed to buckle under the weight of twisted rebar and broken beams. Amid the metallic groans of shifting wreckage, voices called for help, sharp and thin against the grinding of machinery. The scene was a battlefield of urban collapse, a war zone transposed onto city streets. And through this bedlam came one ambulance, its paramedics stepping into dust so thick it seemed to cling to their lungs. Amid the wreckage, Fire Chief Frank Dalton carved through the smoke with authority etched on every line of his face. His boots crushed glass and plaster as he strode to where Rachel Monroe knelt over Daniel Lee's lifeless body. Around them, survivors groaned, yet Dalton's command was sharp, unyielding. By every protocol, Daniel was gone. No pulse, no breathing, over a dozen minutes without circulation. To the crews watching, the case was closed. Dalton's gesture was final, the seasoned order of a man who had declared hundreds beyond saving. Around Rachel, the stares of her peers were heavy, pitying, and damning. Some already turned away to seek living victims. The humiliation of disobedience flared against the back of her neck, yet she remained. In that moment, her defiance wasn't rebellion but conviction, a refusal to surrender even when the weight of authority pressed her into the dirt beneath collapsed stone.
Matt Harris, her partner of 2 years, crouched nearby, his face twisted with concern. His voice held none of Dalton's authority, only weariness as he urged her to stop. The gaze he gave her was worse than Dalton's command, tinged with pity, laced with disbelief. He looked at her as though she were unraveling before his eyes, as though the job, the chaos, and the dead weight under her palms had driven her past reason. Around them, whispers carried through the dust, words sharp enough to pierce even the thick haze. They muttered about stubbornness, about wasting precious minutes, about pride blinding judgment. The weight of humiliation crushed closer. Her partner's doubt cut deeper than orders, a betrayal that suggested madness rather than devotion. Yet Rachel's hands did not falter. Each compression, each press into Daniel's chest was her rebellion against disbelief itself. She carried on, against friend and foe alike. Rachel's voice, raw with urgency, carried through the dust-laden air. 3 minutes, that was all she asked. 3 minutes to defy protocol, to challenge death itself while surrounded by doubters. Her demands silenced even Dalton's sharp authority. Something in her tone, a hardened conviction, hinted at experience beyond civilian paramedicine. Her eyes burned with the fire of someone who had already seen too much surrender on battlefields where hesitation cost lives. Around her, men accustomed to commanding disaster paused, uncertain in the face of such defiance. Humiliation twisted sharper as disapproving glances flickered across her back. To many, she looked desperate, clinging to the already lost. But to her, those minutes were a battlefield wager. Either life would return, or she would shoulder the humiliation of failure, branded reckless in the eyes of her peers. Still, her refusal was unshakable. She had chosen to stand against certainty, no matter the cost.
The collapse dissolved in her mind, replaced by desert heat and blood-soaked canvas tents. Afghanistan. Rachel had been a combat medic, one of the few trained in techniques never meant for civilian eyes. In forward operating bases, where soldiers lay shredded by shrapnel, the line between life and death was stretched thinner than medical textbooks admitted. She remembered the whispered instructions of a special forces medic, the classified methods hidden from official reports, the ancient pressure point techniques fused with modern trauma knowledge. In those moments, surrender was forbidden. Soldiers lived or died by whether medics dared step into the forbidden. Now, kneeling in the dust of Phoenix, the same battlefield instincts surged. She wasn't just refusing to quit, she was invoking a ghostly training carried from war zones where miracles were demanded. This memory burned through her humiliation, hardening her hands with the certainty of someone who had witnessed resurrection. Rachel adjusted her palms, shifting lower than standard placement, angling fingers in ways no paramedic handbook taught. She pressed into points along Daniel's ribs, seeking pathways invisible to monitors but imprinted on her muscle memory. Her thumbs dug deep, creating a rhythm that mimicked but never matched standard compressions. Onlookers exchanged uneasy glances, the strange movements feeding suspicions that desperation had driven her into madness. To them, it looked more like ritual than medicine, her hands moving like a pianist on invisible keys. Dust caked her hair, sweat streaked her brow, yet her concentration was absolute. Each press was not guesswork, but calculation. The sequence drilled into her years ago under flickering tent lights, half a world away. Whispers swelled behind her, pity turning sharper, branding her reckless, delusional. The humiliation was suffocating, but Rachel's rhythm never faltered. She had crossed a threshold where only conviction could guide her.
The crowd's judgment swelled louder than the grinding machinery. Firefighters muttered that she was clinging to a corpse. EMTs shook their heads, pity sharpening into ridicule. Survivors stared, some whispering that the woman was in denial, incapable of letting go. The whispers weren't private, they were meant to be heard, meant to break her will. Humiliation weighed heavier than the dust pressing on her chest. Even her partner's silence felt like a verdict, his eyes refusing to meet hers. To those surrounding her, Rachel was unraveling in the dirt, refusing reality in front of everyone. Yet her hands pressed harder, following sequences they could never understand. Each mutter, each shake of the head, fueled her resolve. The humiliation was not an ending, but the crucible in which her defiance hardened. Still, as seconds bled into minutes, the weight of ridicule pressed against her shoulders, daring her to collapse with it. Then it came, faint as a whisper beneath her fingertips. A tremor, subtle yet undeniable, rippled under Daniel's ribs. To the untrained, it might have been dismissed as reflex, but to Rachel, it was the beginning of war against silence. Her heart hammered, but her face betrayed nothing. She leaned into the rhythm, pressing the sequence with renewed ferocity. To those around her, nothing had changed.
his chest still flat, his lips still blue. But she felt it, the ghost of movement beneath still flesh. The humiliation of their whispers still stung, but now she bore a secret they couldn't see. The first threat of life had returned. The battlefield knowledge whispered in desert tents was no longer theory. Against ridicule, against disbelief, she had found a pulse invisible to the world. A miracle had stirred beneath her hands, fragile as glass, yet powerful enough to split the silence forever.
Rachel's instincts demanded proof. She signaled for the advanced monitor, her hands never breaking rhythm. When the machine connected, its screen flickered faint green lines that struggled, dipped, and rose again in fragile defiance. Weak, irregular, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably real, electrical life pulsed where none should exist. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The very monitor they trusted contradicted their condemnation of her. The humiliation that had wrapped Rachel like chains cracked open, disbelief recoiling into uneasy awe. Firefighters leaned closer, eyes narrowing at the flicker that had no business appearing after so long. What they had mocked as delusion now forced them into silence. The screen pulsed again, faint and jagged, yet undeniable. In that fragile spark, the battlefield method proved its worth. Rachel pressed harder, driving her hands into sequences learned under the shadow of gunfire, dragging Daniel further away from the grip of death. The impossible had been recorded. Frank Dalton, a man who had ordered hundreds of deaths declared in disaster zones, staggered backward. His gruff certainty fractured as the screen betrayed every ounce of protocol he had wielded like a weapon. The humiliation he had forced upon Rachel reflected back onto him, his command undercut by proof that she was right. His silence was deafening, a surrender more potent than any words. Around him, crews who once mocked Rachel now shifted uneasily, unwilling to meet her eyes. For Rachel, it was not triumph, but vindication. She had been crushed under disbelief, branded reckless, nearly shamed into submission. Now the weight lifted as the truth revealed itself in blinking lines of electricity. The humiliation she bore was thrust onto the man who had ordered her to stop. Yet, she didn't gloat, didn't pause. Her focus remained on the fragile spark before her, on life itself, trembling under her hands.
Rachel shifted again, palms pressing into angles that defied recognition. This was the most dangerous part, the step she had dreaded even as she moved into it. The earlier phases had teased electricity into existence. Now she had to convince the heart to pump, to claw circulation back from silence. Each press was precise, chaotic to watching eyes but mathematically perfect to her memory. She risked not only failure, but regression. One miscalculation and the fragile spark would extinguish, condemning her forever as reckless. The humiliation of her peers still lingered like dust, yet she no longer cared for their stares. Only the weight of this final chance mattered. Around her, silence deepened. The entire site stilled as if the city itself held its breath. The battlefield method demanded sacrifice, demanded nerve where others broke. If it failed now, humiliation would be eternal. But if it succeeded, death itself would retreat. The moment cracked the world open. Under Rachel's relentless rhythm, Daniel's chest lurched, then fell, then rose again. Not faint, not imagined, but real. His eyelids fluttered, pupils rolling before locking open, unfocused, yet undeniably alive. A surge of stunned silence gave way to disbelief as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. The man who minutes ago was abandoned as dead had awakened, pulled across the abyss by hands everyone had mocked. Dust clung to his skin, lips still blue, but his eyes, alive eyes, shattered every whisper of futility. Rachel did not pause to savor vindication. She transitioned immediately to stabilize, pushing oxygen, demanding equipment, her battlefield focus narrowing on survival, not spectacle. Yet nothing could erase the truth. Against humiliation, against doubt,
Against absolute certainty of death, Daniel Lee had returned. A corpse had opened his eyes in the dirt of Phoenix, and the city would never forget it.
The same rescuers who muttered pity now stood transfixed, their eyes wide with reverence. Firefighters, EMTs, survivors, each locked in stunned silence as the man who had been written off breathed anew. Whispers began again, not of ridicule, but awe. Disbelief mutating into legend before their eyes. The humiliation that had drenched Rachel moments ago flipped violently into a strange reverence. No one knew what they had witnessed, whether science had bent or miracles had intruded, but they knew they had been wrong. For Rachel, the shift in their stares carried no comfort. She had not fought for their respect, but for the man whose chest now rose with fragile breaths. Yet the weight of reversal pressed heavy. To them, she was no longer stubborn or broken. She was something far more dangerous. She was a paramedic who had proven death was negotiable, and awe carried sharper burdens than ridicule. Amid shattered concrete and broken steel, Daniel's fragile gaze shifted upward, catching Rachel's as oxygen flowed into his lungs. His lips moved faintly, silent shapes that carried meaning no sound could capture. In those moments, the battlefield chaos faded for Rachel, leaving only the impossible gratitude of a man who had been stolen from silence. The awe of Cruz faded into background haze as his trembling eyes anchored her. His life, impossible and fragile, was not just a victory but a burden, a reminder of the razor's edge she had walked to drag him back. Around them, machinery restarted, the disaster pressed on, but for Rachel the moment froze. Against humiliation, against authority, against whispered pity, she had held her ground. The look in Daniel's eyes was enough to prove the cost had been worth it. Yet beneath the fragile triumph, she felt the heavy certainty. Miracles never came twice.
Shouts rose from another section of rubble. Crews unearthed a second victim, a middle-aged woman pinned under concrete, her body pale and still. Elena Vasquez, a local teacher, had been trapped nearly as long as Daniel. Dust streaked her hair, her face slack with silence. The eyes of rescuers turned immediately to Rachel. Their stares were not curious now, but demanding. She had rewritten reality once, now they expected it again. The awe of Daniel's survival hardened into expectation, an invisible hand pressing against Rachel's chest, heavier than Dalton's command had ever been. Around Elena, whispers began, carried on hope rather than ridicule. Maybe the miracle could repeat. Maybe lightning could strike twice. Rachel felt the burden closing in. Every gaze pierced her, pleading yet damning, as if her refusal would be cruelty itself. The battlefield technique had cost her dearly once. Now they demanded she risk it again. The rescue site gathered closer, no longer skeptical, but hungry. Their earlier mockery had turned into something worse, belief. They waited with hushed anticipation, eyes locked on Rachel's every movement as if she carried divinity in her hands. The humiliation she had endured shifted again, mutating into suffocating expectation. To fail now would not just erase Daniel's miracle, it would destroy the fragile faith sprouting among the dust and ruin. Rachel's chest tightened with the weight of unseen chains. She knew what they wanted, knew they demanded a second resurrection as proof the first had not been accident or fluke. But medicine was not spectacle, and battlefields taught harsher lessons than faith could bear. She positioned herself over Elena, feeling the eyes of dozens sear into her back. Their silence was not disbelief this time, it was prayer. She was no longer mocked. She was trapped inside their hope.
Her hands settled on Elena's chest, and the battlefield rhythm returned. Palms pressed into pressure points, fingers traced ancient lines across ribs, movements alien to every protocol. Dust and sweat blurred together, streaking down her arms as she pushed harder, deeper. Around her, silence thickened, broken only by the metallic groans of machinery. The crowd leaned closer, their anticipation palpable. Every compression became theater in their eyes, every press a step toward proving she was something beyond human. Yet Rachel knew the truth. The battlefield method was no promise, only a gamble with death. Her muscles burned as she fought against time, her mind locked on faint possibilities buried inside silence. She refused to look up, refused to see their hungry faces. Humiliation had once been her enemy. Now expectation was worse, chaining her to a stage where failure would brand her not reckless, but a fraud who got lucky. Minutes stretched, each compression heavier than the last. Rachel's arms trembled, her body strained, but Elena remained motionless, skin waxy, lips still blue. No flutter beneath her palms, no flicker on the monitor, no whisper of life. Around her, the hopeful silence soured. Whispers began again, different now, harsher. Some muttered that Daniel's revival must have been misdiagnosis, that the miracle was illusion, that Rachel's defiance had been nothing but luck. The humiliation returned sharper than before. To resurrect one man was miracle. To fail with another branded her reckless pretender. Rachel pulled back at last, sweat dripping, chest heaving, eyes hollow. Elena was gone. The silence that followed was not disbelief, but disappointment, as though the crowd itself felt betrayed. Rachel had dragged one man from the grave, yet left another to rot in dust. Their stares pierced her. She had become miracle worker and fraud in the same breath.
The stillness after Elena's failure was heavier than any explosion. Rescue crews avoided Rachel's gaze, their silence sharper than ridicule. What had been awe only moments before curdled into disillusionment. She felt the weight of betrayal in their stares, as though her inability to conjure a second miracle had stolen hope itself from the rubble. The humiliation struck deeper this time, not the mockery of disbelief, but the quiet condemnation of those who had dared to believe. Around her, boots shuffled, shoulders slumped, and whispers of fluke carried through the dust. The awe had dissolved into bitterness, leaving Rachel exposed, her battlefield methods stripped of its sheen. She rose slowly, hands trembling, body aching, her chest heavy with guilt that wasn't hers to bear. Elena lay still, and Rachel knew the silence around her would cling harder than any applause. She was no longer savior. She was cruel reminder of limits. Matt Harris lingered near her, his silence louder than the whispers of the crowd. His eyes, once bound by loyalty, carried unease that felt like betrayal. He looked at her not with trust, but with fear, as though the woman who had worked beside him for years was now something alien, something dangerous. The humiliation twisted deeper. Her own partner no longer saw her as comrade, but as reckless gambler with lives. The weight of failure pressed harder under his gaze than under Dalton's commands. For a moment, Rachel's arms trembled, her breath caught, as if the battlefield ghosts she carried had finally broken through to reality. She turned away, unwilling to face the questions etched into Matt's silence. If he no longer trusted her, then the burden of what she had done and failed to do was hers alone. Isolation closed in, sharper than the ruins surrounding her.
At Phoenix General, fluorescent light replaced dust, but the judgment remained the same. Doctors gathered around Daniel's bed, their faces etched with disbelief that bordered on accusation. Dr. Amanda Reed led them, her authority slicing through the room like Dalton's had in the ruins. 23 minutes down, she declared the numbers impossible, an insult to medicine itself. The humiliation here was more suffocating than at the rubble. This was the judgment of science, cold and clinical. Rachel stood in silence, their skepticism pressing down like shackles, branding her reckless before her peers in white coats. Every test result that showed Daniel alive only deepened the mystery and their suspicion. To them, Rachel was not a miracle worker, but a liability. A woman who had gambled with a man's brain and somehow won. Their eyes carried no awe, only the hunger for answers she wasn't ready to give.
She carried humiliation inward. Daniel's hand shifted weakly, his eyes opening against the bright lights. Rachel leaned close, watching his lips form words with effort. What he revealed sent a chill through her veins. He had heard them. Every declaration of his death, every whisper that he was gone, every dismissal uttered above his silent body. Even when he could not respond, their abandonment had reached him. The room stilled as his weak gaze locked on hers. Gratitude etched in every trembling muscle of his face. For Rachel, the revelation was heavier than victory. She had not only pulled him back, she had proven that the condemned could still hear the world surrender them. The humiliation shifted again, no longer hers alone, but reflected back onto every rescuer who had turned away. Daniel's fragile eyes carried judgment that no monitor could record, and Rachel bore the weight of knowing she had been his only defiance.
Daniel's wife arrived with tears streaking down her face, throwing herself toward him, then to Rachel with desperate gratitude. Her embrace was fierce, her thanks whispered like a prayer. Around them, however, the doctors exchanged sharp glances, suspicion tightening their expressions. To the family, Rachel was savior. To the medical community, she was a dangerous anomaly who had unsettled the certainty of death. Gratitude and skepticism collided in that hospital corridor, trapping Rachel between worship and condemnation. The humiliation twisted sharper, applause from one side, accusation from the other. No room remained for simple relief. Daniel's fragile recovery was already being rewritten by those who needed explanations, those who craved reason where only gray shadows existed. Rachel's body stiffened under the embrace, her eyes watching doctors whisper in corners. She had saved a man, but she had also shattered a boundary medicine relied on. Gratitude was fleeting, suspicion would last. Outside the hospital walls, whispers multiplied. Paramedics murmured in break rooms, firefighters argued in hushed tones, and the media teased headlines of miracle resurrections. Yet every story carried a darker undertone. Was Daniel ever truly dead, or had Rachel gambled recklessly with a faint spark others missed? The humiliation grew faceless, embedded in rumors she could not fight. Her name was carried like wildfire through the city, her technique dissected by people who had never seen her hands move. For some, she was a legend, for others, a fraud. The duality gnawed at her, heavier than battlefield ghosts. Every retelling sharpened the knife against her reputation, until even allies began to question. To have dragged a man back from death was no shield. It had only invited suspicion, envy, and doubt that clung like smoke. Rachel felt her isolation deepen, the miracle mutating into the burden of rumor and ridicule.
Weeks later, the weight grew heavier when a sealed envelope arrived. An official summons. Rachel was called to appear before federal authorities. The government had heard whispers of what she had done, and they wanted the truth. No longer rumor, no longer awe or ridicule. This was power demanding ownership. Her hands, once mocked in dust, were now bound by summons inked with seals. The humiliation shifted again, no longer public, but personal. She was no longer judged by firefighters or doctors, but by unseen officials who viewed her not as savior, but as resource. What she carried was no longer hers. The battlefield method, once whispered and tense and guarded by silence, was now a national interest. As she stared at the summons, Rachel felt the trap closing. To refuse would brand her fraud. To accept would chain her knowledge to men who saw only strategy, not lives. Rachel sat in the quiet of her apartment, the city lights stretching across Phoenix like fractured constellations. The summons lay on her table, its weight heavier than rubble. She replayed Elena's stillness, Daniel's awakening, the whispers of fraud, the gratitude of family, the suspicion of doctors. Every outcome haunted her. To share the technique meant releasing a weapon into hands that might not bear its weight. To keep it secret meant condemning future Daniels to silence. It was no longer about humiliation, but about burden, the crushing weight of being the only one holding forbidden knowledge. In Afghanistan, the chain of command had carried some of that weight. Here, she was alone. She stared at her hands, still remembering the rhythm burned into muscle memory. They had dragged one man from the grave and failed another. Now those same hands would decide whether the secret stayed buried or spread.
The panel room smelled of paper and authority. Officials lined a long table, their eyes cold, analytical, predatory. They demanded proof, demanded explanation, demanded surrender of the secret she carried. Rachel stood before them not as savior, but as subject. Every humiliation she had endured, mockery at the rubble, dismissal in the hospital, whispers of fraud, condensed into this moment. Here the stakes were absolute. Either she admitted it had been chance, reducing her to accident, or she unveiled a method they would seize and weaponize. Their questions struck like blades, cutting at her confidence, stripping her of defiance. Humiliation returned sharper than ever, this time institutional, polished, sanctioned. To them she was not a woman but a phenomenon to dissect. The tribunal was not about Daniel or Elena, it was about control. Rachel realized too late that miracles were never free. They were debts collected in rooms like this. The pen scratched against paper as Rachel signed the agreement, her name binding her to secrecy under the weight of classified law. The officials nodded, satisfied, their eyes already turning her into asset, not person. She rose with her chest heavy, her breath uneven, her hands trembling from a burden she could no longer share. Outside, the city pulsed as though nothing had changed, yet Rachel carried chains invisible to all but her. Daniel lived, Elena remained gone, and her name was etched into whispers of miracle and fraud alike. She had proven death negotiable, but in doing so, she had bound herself to forces that would never let her forget. Her face hardened as she stepped into the night. She was no longer simply paramedic. She was prisoner of knowledge too heavy for one person, trapped forever between savior and fraud. Her legacy sealed in shadows,